I'd like to encourage you to be turning with me to the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 5. Over the past several weeks, we've been talking about the flesh and the spirit. And we've talked about the conflict that we find between the flesh and the spirit. And what the Apostle Paul is denoting here within the context of Galatians chapter 5. Now, last week, we talked about those deeds of the flesh in verse 19. We talked about immorality, impurity, and sensuality. And those things that divide us and keep us from the kingdom of God. Now, what we're doing in this study is looking at each of these things so that we can understand what is being taught here and how we as God's children and others in the world should apply these things. Because so many times, whenever you look at a list like we find within this, I have a tendency to read through, not to read the words, but to just go through it. But that does not give me a biblical understanding of what God is giving us by inspiration. So we begin there in verse 19 talking about the deeds of the flesh. We talked about immorality, impurity, sensuality. We broke all of those things down. And if you're interested, you can go back over and you can look at the video that we have posted on that. This morning, we are moving into verse 20 of Galatians chapter 5. And I noted here two things. Number one, idolatry and sorcery. Now, we live in a time that people would look at those two words and they would say, well, I don't see any great idols anywhere in our world. Or they would say, well, there are those people out there on the fringe that think they're sorcerers or they're witches. And I like to watch these little movies and stuff about all of that. And the sad thing is that even though we might perceive it that way, idolatry and sorcery are two things that plague our world today deeply. Now, I'm not going to promise that we're going to get to all of this morning. As I put this lesson together and as I studied on it, I thought, well, I want to do two of them at a time here, but we may not get that accomplished this morning. We may break this down and this morning talk about idolatry, because idolatry is so prevalent in our world today. So in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 20, it gives us this listing. And idolatry is something that we need to understand because it is so proliferant in our world. It is defined as a worship of false gods, idolatry, of the formal sacrificial feast held in honor of false gods, and Arvis as a worship of mammon. In the plural, the vices springing from idolatry and particular to it. Now, that comes from the Thayer lexicon. And it brings to light the idea of false gods. Now, in the Roman times, when the Bible was written, when Galatians 5 was written, idolatry was very prominent in the Roman world. And you can go back and you can look at history of all the great temples that was built, and an idol was set up in that temple. Some kind, usually of stone, in those large temples. And people were going to these places and they were worshiping these idols, these stone figurines, if you will. But if you go back and you look at that, and you think about the study that we did about the 7 churches of Asia, because these kind of things were very prominent in those groups, in those communities, these pagan idols. Well, there was a whole lot going on that gets back to that idolatry, that gets back to immorality that was going on in these places. And the so-called priests of these pagan religions had power over the people. That's something you need to realize. These pagan religions, the priests, those important individuals or priestesses, they had power over the populace. And we talked a lot about that whenever we studied the 7 churches of Asia. Well, that was the big ones. And I'm not going to list those all off this morning. You can go back and look. But if you remember, there was a silversmith that got a little perturbed about Jesus and some of the apostles whenever they were cutting into his business, because he was making what? Idols. He was making silver idols and selling them. And people of the time would buy, even the Jews would buy these little idols, and they would place them in their homes. And they would worship these little idols. Some of them were silver, gold if you were rich, I guess. A lot of these were wooden, these little idols. And it wasn't just in Jerusalem and that area of the Mediterranean Sea that this was going on. The worship of a graven image, a man-produced image, was proliferate across the world. I don't care where you go in the world, if you look at history, you will find these objects of worships. Whenever people turn their back on the one true and living God, they will worship something. And whatever it is, however it begins, the stages of idolatry boil down to, I like this image, whatever it may be, and I like what's going on around it. Again, let's go to what we've already studied, the 7 churches of Asia. The idolatrous religious activities of the time of that writing was atrocious. The morality was not there at all. To be part of that, you had to be involved in the depths of immorality, because it was sold at the temple or on the streets thereof. You had to give a certain amount of your funds to that temple. And if you didn't, they would come visit you. But you could live any way that you wanted to in the world. You could live as worldly as you wanted. You could live as immoral as you wanted. But if you said, well, this is my God or this is my goddess, then you were okay. As long as you did, even pagan religions, you got to do your part. And that is support those individuals that are propagating that situation. You know, we think about the Grecian gods and the influence that those who promoted the Grecian god Zeus and all of those, how much power they had over Rome. And these were Grecian gods. And how that if something else that was different from them came in, they would get rid of it. They didn't like the Jews, but sometimes at this time period they would tolerate the Jews. But when Christianity come in, no. That's the reason that so many Christians ended up in the theater in Rome and dead. That's why Nero murdered so many Christians, because they were teaching something different than the idolatrous religions were teaching. If it looks good, sounds good, feels good, smells good, people will fall for anything. And people wind up worshiping the idol or the image itself. Let's look at Romans chapter 1. It talks about this, starting in verse 18. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." We talked in Bible class there a while ago about those that are slaves of sin are unrighteous. In other words, those that manifest the things that we find listed in Galatians 5, verses 19 through 22 there, those folks have fallen into this situation of ungodliness. They're unrighteous. And they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. They don't want to hear it. Well, the pagan religions didn't want to hear about Jesus. Verse 19. "Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them." Most people have a concept, at least, about God, because they look out into the world and they see His creation. Now, they may reject it, they may suppress it, but yet in the back of their mind, there's something about this God. Verse 20. "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood though what has been made, or through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Just what I said. Look out in the world. How can all this be without a creator, even though there are those who want to suppress that reality? Verse 21. "For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened." In essence, they knew about God, but they turned their back on Him. And as we have noted many times, humanity turned their back on God from the beginning until the flood. Noah and his family came through the waters to be saved. And yet it wasn't long after that mankind, humanity, turned their back on God again and started following something else, something man-made, for a better phrase. Human-made. I want you to think about that phrase just a minute. We have God made. And that's what we find in the Bible. It's what God made. And if we follow what God made, we have to be obedient to Him because we're slaves of righteousness. But if we make it up ourselves, we don't have to worry about following what God said. We can do whatever we want. And folks, I like to do whatever I want. I tell Linda all the time, darling, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do what I want to do. And she says, get over and do that. Nah, she don't do that. But you understand the situation. I want to do what I want to do, and I want to do it my way. I don't want somebody to tell me what to do. But if I want all the blessings that God has given us through His grace we talked about today, I'll do things God's way. The opposite is something I do not want to be a part of. The alternative. Verse 22. Professing to be wise. Think about that. I know more than God. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and or birds or four-footed animals or crawling creatures. They threw God away for something they made up themselves. And again, let me reiterate. This is not something that just happened over there in the Mediterranean area where Jesus was, the apostles were, Moses. It wasn't just there, even though it was. You think about the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks. You think about all the previous nations that were over there. All of them had their pagan gods, their man-made religious things. Well, normally today we do not see a great influence, that's a good word, of pagan objects like talked about here. Images in the form of. But yet, in some instances, they're still around. And you can see people who are worshipful to some statue, some picture, some gold or silver necklace. The list literally goes on and on. It's not gone. It's just out there. And sadly, in some instances, I don't know if the word accepted is a good word or just we don't think much about it because it's so common. But idolatry likened to that is still there. People are worshiping the created forms and not God. They're following their own desires and not God. Well, that leaves out those that say they're following God, but following their man-made ideologies. Same story. I may say that I'm following the one true and living God, and I can follow the idolatries of people and be just as much in trouble as if I was worshiping a dragon. If I had a carved dragon at my house and I was worshiping that. And somebody says, "Oh, John, there are dragons." Yeah, there was dragons. Don't fret that. Well, what about the other idolatry in our world that does not have what we would perceive as the image of an idol? And there's a lot more of that than there are images of idols in our world. In the book of Ephesians, Paul defines covetousness as idolatry. In Ephesians chapter 5, starting there in verse 3, it says, "But immorality or any impurity or greed must not be named among you as is proper among the saints. And there must be no filthiness or silly talk or coarse jesting that is not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this you know for certain, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has the inheritance of the kingdom of Christ and God." Covetous. Covetousness denotes the idea that I want what you have. And I want it right now. That's covetousness. And if you go back and you look at that word, it brings to light the desire that I'll do anything I got to do to have what you have. Do you think covetousness is in our world today? Absolutely. It's rampant. And here's the problem with covetousness. Covetousness is not like you're driving down the road and you see somebody in a nice vehicle and you say, "Man, I'd like to have one like that." No, that's not what I'm talking about. Covetousness is whenever the individual is so focused on getting other people's stuff, they don't ever think about God. Because we understand that theft is sin, not fitting. So the covetous individual has their focus on one thing, and that's what somebody else has. Their focus is not on God. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 4, it says, "Therefore consider the members of your body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desires, and greed, which amounts to idolatry." All of those things above. How many people are so focused on immoral and impure activities that they say, "I'm not thinking about God because I want my flesh. I want my flesh taken care of." Or passion, evil desires. Those things. They get so focused on the things of the world, they forget about God. And he puts greed in here also. Colossians 3, verse 6. "For it is because of these things that the wrath of God is come upon the sons of disobedience. And in them you also once walked when you were living in them." The Colossian people had been involved with all of these things, which amounted to idolatry, but they had left and become children of God. Idolatry can be manifest when one has a strong desire for the material, the fleshly, and the worldly things that one allows, now listen to me, that one allows to replace God. That's idolatry. Now, if I got so focused, and you fill in the blank, because there's so many illustrations of this in our world. If I get so focused on one activity, at one thing in my life, that I'm going to be involved in this and forget God, that's idolatry. And folks, if I get so involved in whatever it is over here, let's say for instance this, all of you know how much I enjoy watching the weather. I do. But if I allow my weather watching, I don't like the tornadoes. I don't like the hail. I do like the rain. I don't like the freezing cold. So there's parts I like, part I don't like. But if I focus my entire world on that, it becomes idolatry. And if I take my children, well, I'm down here with my children. If I take my children, because they're all up here, if I take my children and I make sure they know all about the weather, and I'm constantly teaching my children about the weather. I'm constantly teaching them how to read a radar. I'm constantly informing them, you need to go to the cellar. But I don't teach them about God. What am I teaching them to do? If that's my focus, God's over here, out of sight, out of mind, I'm teaching them how to be idolaters. In Matthew 6, verse 19, it says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. Take the word treasure and put whatever it is that is more important than God in your life. Whatever it is. Weather watching. Do not store up for yourself weather watching and all of those implements and spend all your money on that and do all these things and buy you a vehicle and go out and chase tornadoes, which is really cool. I don't chase them. I'm a turkey hunter. I always wait till they come to me. Spend all your money on that, but don't do anything for God. Well, all those things that I've spent all my funds on, all my time, all my energy, not going to last. Verse 20. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. My priority is God. My other priority is watching the weather and investing in that. But God is my priority, period. Guess what? God created the weather. God's in charge anyway, but I like to watch. Where's our treasure? Is it in the things of the world that can lead us to idolatry and separation from God? Or is it in God, and then we do those things in the world that interests us? Verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. When the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, and he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. What is our focus? That's the key. If it's not God, it can become idolatry. That does not negate all the things we enjoy to do in the world. It doesn't. It just means that our primary is God. Our primary is living a Christian lifestyle. Our primary is being obedient to what God tells us to do, even though we are involved in other things. In 1 John 5, verse 21, it says, "Little children, guard yourselves from idols, whatever kind they may be." Don't allow yourself to be taken over by the idolatrous world in which we live. Because I would concur that the majority of people in our world today are idol worshipers, because they have turned their back on the true and living God. Next Lord's Day morning, we'll talk about the sorcerers, because I'm not going to get to it this morning. But beware, little children, guard yourself from idols. If there's a need on your heart this morning that we can assist you with, please allow us to do so. Come now, as together we stand and as we sing.